like to welcome our final speaker for today, Mr. Zach Honoroff. Zach Honoroff is the Associate Director for Violence Reduction Services with the University of Chicago Crime Lab, where he helps lead the organization's portfolio of violence reduction research and technical assistance work. Since 2008, the University of Chicago Crime Lab has been partnering with government agencies and nonprofits to help design and test promising ways to reduce the social harms from both crime and the administration of criminal justice itself. Prior to joining the Crime Lab, Zach was a graduate fellow with the Chicago Mayor's Office, where he focused on juvenile justice, police reform, and other public safety priorities. And before that, worked on economic development issues in New Jersey. Zach holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. Thank you for joining us today, Zach.
Check.
Okay. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Oh, wonderful. I know we're running short on time, so I'll try to compress this as much as possible. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, a little bit about our sort of origin, what our model is, and then I'm going to highlight a couple of our projects that are within the violence prevention and reduction space, and some of our findings, and then just close it out. So if we go back to 2006, 2007, some of you might recall at that time, there was a new series that was put out in the Chicago Tribune that started chronicling and counting the number of young people in Chicago that were shot and killed. And if you pause for a second and think about the fact that there were enough shootings and killings of young people in Chicago such that a major news outlet like the Chicago Tribune was devoting time and resources to counting each one of them and telling those stories, I think that's pretty striking and tells you sort of where we were at that time with the gun violence problem. So later that fall, at the University of Chicago, a young doctoral student from Senegal, he was walking home from class a couple steps from the university, and tragically he was shot and killed in a robbery that just went wrong. So this event, sort of coupled with the reframing of the media narrative around gun violence that had been occurring for some time, it sort of shocked the university community and galvanized them to start doing some soul searching. You know, we're in Hyde Park, we're on the South Side, just steps from some neighborhoods that experience the highest rates of violence in the city, yet the university community wasn't really doing anything to address that problem. So the university asked a new crime economist who had just arrived from Georgetown, Jens Ludwig, to devote some time among him and his partners to be thinking about what could the university do to leverage the resources of a place like the University of Chicago to address the problem of gun violence. So one of their first ideas was, oops, sorry, the slides. Okay, there we are. One of the first ideas was, okay, we've got a mass of students and faculty here at the university who want to engage in social change and think about how to fix this problem of gun violence. Why don't we get them involved in direct service? We're so close to the community. Let's think about how to use their skills and enthusiasm to do that. But quickly, that was dismissed because that's not really the best place at the time they thought for the university to plug in. There are already so many amazing organizations doing work on the ground. They should keep doing that. Instead, they thought, okay, as a world-class university with Nobel laureates, research expertise, let's instead think about how we can generate rigorous evidence about what works that's happening on the ground now and use that to be a catalyst for public resources to scale up those services that are working. And if you think about some of the leading causes of death throughout the 20th century, things like polio, diphtheria, typhoid, heart disease, car accidents, things that petrified families early in the 20th century, government and industry devoted massive resources to thinking about research and development, how we could innovate solutions to these problems. And if you look throughout the 20th century, fatalities declined dramatically. But we hadn't been devoting that sort of capacity and resources to social policy. So that's sort of the conceit of the Crime Lab, is thinking about how to work with a range of government agencies and community partners who are doing work on the ground, identify promising solutions to some serious urban challenges like gun violence, leverage the tools from the social sciences to test those test those ideas using rigorous methodologies like randomized control trials, machine learning, predictive analytics, things like that. And then those that we find to be most effective and cost effective, work with the public sector, which is hopefully sort of bought in from the beginning, to scale those resources to reach a broader population and find longer, more sustainable funding streams to support those interventions. And so to do this work, we modest philanthropic donations from foundations and some individual donors to engage in these sort of small demonstration projects to generate this evidence. And then we work with the public sector, the city, the county, the state, to find resources to scale those up and reach a broader population. Something else that I think sets us apart a bit from other sort of research practice partnerships that we find in university settings is that our primary goal is not research for research's sake. We're not there to publish papers. We're not there to find the most interesting research methodologies. Our priority is to use those tools to serve the priorities of civic and community partners that are doing the work of violence reduction and improving outcomes for youth. So just to give you a sense, these are some of our partners in the government sector. So we work very closely with Chicago Public Schools, the police department in Chicago, the Department of Family and Support Services, which is the city's largest social service provider, city colleges, the fire department, a whole range. And then on the community side, I know a number of our partners in the room through programs like READY, which I'll talk a little bit about, youth guidance, Check and Connect, My Block, My Hood, My City, a whole range. And again, just wanting to emphasize that, these are the experts. They are doing the work that matters on the ground. Our goal is to just generate evidence about what they're doing so that they can get better resources and more resources to do that, build data capacity to understand the nature of violence and crime, things like that. So I'm going to talk first about a few of our projects that focus on preventing crime and violence in ways that reduce our reliance on the criminal justice system, so more from the social service sector. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about our work with some law enforcement partners as well. So first, I'm going to talk about an evaluation of a program called Becoming a Man, which I imagine folks in the room might be familiar with, run by a nonprofit called Youth Guidance. Generally, they use insights from behavioral science to reduce violence among youth. So back in 2008, when we were founded, our faculty directors engaged in a sort of autopsy of every single case of someone being shot and murdered in Chicago for a year, to try and understand who was involved, what were the circumstances of those incidents, trying to understand at a very, very granular level what's going on, to help us think about who should we be starting to engage with to sort of test this model of our organization. And so what they found is that in almost 75% of the cases that they looked at for that year, the root cause could be described as something like an altercation. So often, violence in Chicago at the time had sort of been painted with a broad brush of gang violence. That's it, it's gang violence. But what we found is actually that they often stem from arguments among young people who were arguing about the same things that young people everywhere argue about. Someone stole my bike, you looked at my friend the wrong way, you ditched me yesterday, whatever it was. But in these neighborhoods, in some of Chicago's most under-resourced neighborhoods, these altercations were quickly escalating to violence and murder in many cases without what seemed like a lot of forethought. And environments in which young people in some of Chicago's most under-resourced neighborhoods grow up in can condition them to react in some of these automatic ways, not sort of thinking through what's going on, but automatically reacting, sometimes in outbursts of anger. And sometimes that you can imagine that response can be helpful in sometimes even meaning the difference between life or death. But in other settings, like in school or on the job, that response can be very harmful, much more than it is helpful. So once we sort of identified this, our goal was to look to the community, look to our community partners, and find interventions that might be working to address the specific sort of root cause, so to speak, through interventions that might be helping young people slow down their thought processes and think through their actions. And maybe that is a way that we can sort of eschew violence. And so we held what we call the design competition. So a call for submissions from around the city from social service providers who were having some of the best ideas around about how to reduce youth violence. And so the winner of this competition would receive some seed funding that we raised from philanthropic organizations, as well as be subject to a rigorous evaluation, a randomized control trial, the sort of gold standard research that we see in fields like medicine and such. So the winner was Youth Guidance for their program, Becoming a Man, which is primarily a school-based intervention focused on serving young men in high school who in some of the city's most under-resourced neighborhoods. So essentially the program, I'm simplifying this very much, but it consists of 1 hour of cognitive behavioral therapy group sessions a week in school during the school day with a counselor. And the counselor is often somebody who's not that much older from the young men who are in high school and come from the same neighborhoods. And most importantly, they're seen as a credible messenger. I think we talked about that earlier today. So that they can convey the lessons of CBT in a way that's receptive among the students. But the counselors are also in school full-time. They're there to sort of deal with ad hoc issues, help sort of mentorship along the way, conflicts that might arise. So they're building relationships with their students every day, but also taking those lessons from CBT and reinforcing them outside the classroom. So, as many of you probably know, violence in Chicago is disproportionately concentrated in the south and west sides of the city. And so to understand the effectiveness of BAM, to structure our RCT, our randomized control trial, we worked with Chicago Public Schools to identify a number of neighborhood high schools in these community areas where the schools were open to receiving the intervention and would be open to randomizing students to either be offered the program or to continue along with their regular services. And so for the first study, we engaged in a couple studies of the program over a couple years. In this first year, we worked with 17 high schools in the south and west sides and worked with 7th through 10th graders, randomly assigning half to be offered the program and half to just continue on with their regular services. And that's an important point to pause on with RCTs is, we want to be, especially in a school setting, we want to be conscious that we're limiting the burden that a study can place on students in the schools. So for someone in the control group, so not being offered the treatment, they're not being restricted from any other services. They're able to continue on having access to anything else. And oftentimes, because there are fewer spots in a program like BAM than how many students are eligible, this can be a way to more equitably allocate resources. So there's no subjective decision in deciding who gets the program or not. It's purely, it's a coin flip, 50-50 chance that you get offered or not. And so in the first study in 2009, 2010, that academic year, we found really encouraging results. We found that when we compared the students who were offered the program to those who were not, we found a 45% decrease in violent crime arrests, which was huge, more than we had anticipated and really encouraging. We also saw an increase in a school engagement index, which is sort of a composite measure of attendance, courses failed, whether or not you were enrolled by the end of the school year. And so based on those results and some of the other literature around youth violence interventions, we also predicted that this might lead to an increase in graduation rate. But we would have to follow the students throughout high school to study that. But you might say, okay, this happened once, anything can happen once. You're lucky. Maybe it was something special about the schools you were in, the students who you're working with, the counselors. So we wanted to replicate this study with an entirely different population, different group of students, different schools, different counselors. And when we did that a couple years later, we found similar results. They replicated a 50% drop in violent crime arrests. So this really excited the city, the mayor at the time, Mayor Emanuel, and the city invested resources into scaling up BAM to a number of schools around the city. And then I mentioned before that we were hoping to see an increase in graduation rate, and we did as well. Once we were able to follow that first cohort of students through high school, we found a 19% increase in graduation rates. So I think we remember that guy. So I think there were really 3 key takeaways from this study, this first major study of ours a couple of years ago. So one, we found that BAM itself, the program Becoming a Man, seems to be an effective way of reducing violence. That's sort of undisputed through the study. But more importantly, 2, is that through some additional qualitative work and a mechanism study that we conducted, we found that it's not something specific to BAM itself, what's really driving that change, that reduction of violence, is the CBTs, the cognitive behavioral therapy, and how it's being conveyed. And that's really exciting, because what that means is this study isn't telling us that we have to funnel all of our resources to one program. While BAM is incredibly effective and they've scaled nationally, there are so many other programs that are using CBT-informed practices to try and reach this population. And so a study like this really opened up that line of service delivery and showed that, you know, the city could be thinking about a whole range of other programs and service providers around the city that are engaging in this kind of work, and look to them as well, not just this one program. And the third takeaway is what I mentioned, that, you know, the city and Chicago Public Schools were so bought into this process and galvanized by these results that they were then able to put it as a line item in CPS's budget and find sustainable long-term resources to scale this program citywide. So now I think latest count is BAM is in over 100 schools around Chicago, and they've scaled to other cities like Boston and some places on the West Coast. And we like to show this slide just because in 2013, President Obama came to the city to talk in the wake of a really tragic shooting of a young high school girl. And he asked the mayor at the time, you know, I've got a little bit of time this afternoon, where should I go? And he said, you got to go to a BAM circle. So he went down to Hyde Park Academy, and he sat, this is a CBT session in the classroom, and he sat with them, and he only had 15 minutes, but he ended up staying about an hour, having conversations one-on-one. And many of you might have heard of his initiative, My Brother's Keeper. And so a lot of the lessons he learned here, you know, we found later were sort of informed his creation of the My Brother's Keeper initiative. So this was really, you know, Crime Lab's first sort of proof of concept that we could take the tools from social sciences, generate evidence about a program that seems promising, find those rigorous results, and then the public sector can use that to scale a program up. And so that really was our sort of first foray into this space. And so the early work of BAM demonstrated the promise of this sort of research practice partnership in understanding the results of a school-based intervention. But I think we all know that many of the young people at the heart of the gun violence problem are not engaged in school. They're not in formal settings. So they also often have many complex needs: justice involvement, housing instability, problems at home, things like that. So what sort of service might be right for that population that's a little bit more in higher need and facing more complex challenges? So in 2015, we launched another one of these design competitions in partnership with a number of the funders that are listed here: MacArthur, the Chicago Sports Alliance, Pritzker Pucker, along with the city, to try and identify a service that would be a bit more intensive in targeting this population that would be more disengaged with school. And so the winner was a program called Choose to Change, which is delivered jointly by two organizations, Youth Advocate Programs and Children's Home and Aid. And again, the winner received about $1 million in funding that we raised in seed funding, and again would be subject to a randomized control trial. So Choose to Change, just briefly, it's a 6-month program targeting youth between the ages of 13 and 18 with a suite of more intensive behavioral health support and relentless engagement. And so primarily it consists of 8 hours a week of one-on-one work with a mentor, and then mostly in a school setting, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy treatment. And this looks a little bit differently than the curriculum that we saw with BAM. It's the Sparks curriculum, so it's tailored towards individuals who are at higher risk. And so youth advocates from Youth Advocate Programs are the first primary point of contact with the students. They work for about 2 months with participants, understanding their specific needs and tailoring an individualized service plan. So a lot of that might be also working with a family to understand what are the barriers to these students engaging in school. And so, you know, one story that was shared with us from our partners is there was one student in particular who wasn't showing up to school. After some time of working with the advocate, learned that a lot of the barrier was the fact that they didn't have access to clean clothes. So the advocate will work with a young person to address a need like that can sort of help stabilize them and remove these sorts of barriers that are preventing them from engaging in school, and therefore, if enrolled in this program, barriers that are preventing them from getting the lessons through CBT. And so after these 2 months, the advocate will give a warm handoff to the group CBT that happens mostly in a school setting. And one of the really unique things about Choose to Change is that the advocates who are working with these students, they actually sit in the group CBT with the students. So they're learning the lessons of CBT along with the student, and so they can reinforce those lessons in the 8 hours a week they have with their students outside the classroom. So, I mentioned that this was a program that was aiming to reach, individuals with more complex needs. And so by looking at some of the administrative data on these students, we actually find that they are in fact reaching this population. So for example, 20% are housing or homeless or housing unstable. Almost 40% have a prior arrest. 24% have an individualized education plan. 22% are not enrolled in school at some point during the prior year. And then the map on the right is showing the different neighborhoods, the community areas in Chicago where Choose to Change participants live. And the community areas outlined in black are those that have been identified by the city as the 15 community areas with the highest levels of violence measured by rates of fatal and non-fatal shootings. And you can see that most of the students or the young people who are in Choose to Change are coming from these neighborhoods that are experiencing violence. And so they're living amongst trauma day in and day out and experiencing these complex challenges. And I should also add, a number of the students or the young people are referred from neighborhood high schools that they attend, but because not all of them are in school, we're also getting referrals from, for example, the juvenile detention center and probation and sources like that. So we can reach this population that's maybe not engaged in school at the moment. And so we studied the program again using a randomized control trial. And we found that the program reduces violent crime arrests by about 40%. So again, a big reduction, sort of in line with what we saw with BAM, but again, reaching this more, less engaged population with more complex needs. But what's really, I think, most exciting about these results is the fact that they persist. So most of the time in these sorts of studies, we see that the effects are dropping off after maybe 6 months or a year. But what we found with Choose to Change is 1.5 years after a student ends the program, we're still seeing dramatic reductions in violent crime arrests, almost 40%. And then 2.5 years after, we find that Choose to Change is reducing the probability of any arrest. So not only is it reducing involvement in violence, it's also reducing interaction with the criminal justice system by that measure at all. We also find some educational outcomes. I think the most exciting one being that we're seeing an increases in attendance by over a full week of school. We're also seeing a decrease in misconduct incidents in CPS. We weren't able to detect a change on GPA, but we actually think that's okay. One, because this isn't primarily an education-focused intervention, and two, if you think about the population of young people that we're trying to reach, they're on the margins of attending school. So if we're able to get them to be attending more often, then maybe later down the road we can also work towards improving their outcome, their performance in school as well. So I want to just sort of pause for a second before I continue with another two projects and step back and show you just this graph of these trend lines of homicide rates in Chicago, the red line, compared to the two other largest cities in the country. And you can see, for the last 20 years, Chicago begins to diverge. New York and LA homicide rates are decreasing steadily, but in Chicago we see a stagnation. And then that big spike there is 2016. And I think many in the room might be familiar with the fact that in 2016, we experienced a very tragic spike in homicides, about 60% increase relative to the year before. About 764 individuals were killed in Chicago that year. And so we and a lot of other research organizations and our partners have done a lot of work to try to understand why this is the case. Why in Chicago are we not seeing the same decrease as we see in other large cities, and why is this spike there? And the unsatisfying answer is we don't know. There's no one cause. There are a lot of candidate theories around that. But what we do know is that violence in Chicago, and I'm sure you all know this, disproportionately is affecting certain neighborhoods, like I showed in that map a couple slides ago, but also disproportionately affecting certain individuals. So specifically, we know that young men of color, particularly young Black men, are experiencing higher risks of homicide relative to other subgroups and relative to the citywide average. So in fact, here, this top bar is showing the homicide rate among Black men between ages of 15 and 24. They're 6 times more likely to experience a homicide than Hispanic men of the same age, and 32 times more likely than young white men. So that shows you that the risk is so much greater among this subset of individuals. But while we know the risk to be greater among young men, the prevalence of violence is greater among adult men. So we actually find that almost 90% of all shooting victims in Chicago are men over the age of 18. And to put a finer point on it, 75% of all victims are over the age of 25. But when you think about the services that are available from the social service sector for violence reduction, most of them focus on youth. And that is warranted, that makes sense given all that we talked about today and the problem of youth violence. But it's ignoring this population of adult men who are making up the largest share of victims in Chicago. And if we want to think about a meaningful way to drive down violence wholesale in Chicago, we can't be ignoring that population who is making up the largest number of victims in Chicago. And so I know Eddie spoke very elegantly this morning about Ready. I'm going to touch on a few aspects of it, and we have some partners in the room from Ready as well. But it was sort of in the wake of this realization, this service gap, as well as following this tragic spike in 2016, that a number of major funders in Chicago got together with the crime lab, with a couple other organizations, and thought, okay, if money was no object, what's the combination of services that's going to reach this population that is at highest risk of violence involvement in Chicago? And so Heartland Alliance, which you've heard about, well known for their work in transitional jobs, took on the work of delivering a new intensive program that would be tailored among several types of interventions and working with a number of organizations on the ground in Chicago to reach this population of adult men who are at highest risk of involvement in gun violence, either as a victim or as a perpetrator, because we often see in the data that those can be interchanged pretty frequently and put them on a safer path. But if we know that we want to serve this population, how do we know what's going to keep them safe? What combination of services? So Ready, which I'm sure you heard, is mostly comprised of intensive cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as paid transitional jobs. And there are years of promising evidence around these two types of interventions. So one, with CBT, we've talked about. We saw in BAM, we saw it through Choose to Change. We've also seen CBT reduce violence in other settings, like in the Juvenile Detention Center in Chicago as well. And two, paid transitional jobs. So there was a groundbreaking study out of Liberia, actually, where ex-combatants of the Civil War there were delivered CBT and found that incidents of serious violence decreased by almost half. But when that was paired with a cash grant, those results persisted much longer. And we've also done some work around youth employment programs in Chicago, One Summer Chicago, many of you have heard of, as well as in New York, and found that those youth employment programs were driving down violence as well among participants, and those effects also persisted beyond exit from the program. But we don't actually know if that combination of services is going to be effective in Chicago for this specific population of adult men who are at highest risk of gun violence involvement, which is why we're again working with Heartland Alliance and the other providers to structure a randomized control trial to study the impact of Ready Chicago's combination of services among the specific population. And so in our study, we're looking at three main outcomes broadly. One, does Ready reduce involvement in violent crime? And that's going to be measured looking at police department data on shootings and homicides. Two, does it reduce involvement in the criminal justice system? So for that, we'll also look at data on prior arrests and time in detention facilities, community supervision, things like that. And then we also hope to look at whether the program is increasing employment or earnings. And for that, we're still exploring data availability around employment and earnings, but we hope to be able to look at that. And so, because as I'm sure you heard from Eddie, Ready is relentless in how it engages its participants, working with a number of street outreach organizations to find those men who are at highest risk and might be difficult to engage, at least from the get-go. So to make sure that Ready is not allowing men to fall through the cracks, they've instituted 3 different referral pathways to find these individuals. So one, sort of more traditional community referrals, so working with organizations like INDC and a number of others to engage in traditional street outreach to find those individuals by, through the expertise of outreach workers and their relationships and their familiarity with the communities in which they work. The second pathway is something that's a little bit more data informed. And so that's working with Cook County Jail, Illinois Department of Corrections, to identify men who are coming out of detention and returning to the community. And among those men who are eligible for this program, and to get them into services as well. And the third pathway is, I think, one of the more unique things about Ready, and this is purely a data-driven approach, and it makes use of an algorithm that the crime lab built in-house using data from the police department on prior arrests, shootings, victimization, also data on social networks of individuals. And we take those many variables, we weigh them, we look at interactions, and we spit out a predictive score. What is the likelihood that that individual is going to be involved in gang violence, either as a victim or a perpetrator, over the next 18 months? And so we get that information and we provide those names to the outreach workers. And the outreach workers then go engage in their ordinary traditional street outreach to try and find these men. But what's key about this is that we're finding that the men identified through the Urban Labs referral, through our assessment that we built, are often men that would not have been found using traditional outreach networks. And there was a long process where we sort of worked with outreach workers to help them understand the data that we were using and finding, and ask them, are these men that, in your expert opinion, you would qualify as being among the highest risk? And through that process, we sort of each learned from each other about, what can data inform about the community process and vice versa. And it's been, I think, especially for the research team that's involved with this project specifically, it's been really amazing to see that sort of evolution of the integration between what we see in data and what we know from community intelligence and intuition. So now that we've been studying the program for about a year, we're able to look at some administrative data sources, as well as some survey and needs assessment work that Heartland did, to see if, in fact, is Ready reaching this population that has these complex needs, is at highest risk of violence involvement. And by a number of indicators, we think they are. So we see that almost 100% of everyone in the program has been arrested before. About 60% has served time in prison previously. 78% lost family to gun violence. I think it's a really powerful indicator. Over half have children at home, and a number are housing insecure. And there's also some data on involvement with drug addiction and other sorts of complex needs. And I think this really justifies the sort of holistic wraparound services that Ready is implementing. And just to sort of contextualize the violence that is being experienced among Ready participants, we like to show this graph. So at the bottom, we see the rate of shooting and homicide victimizations is about 0.1. So what that means is, if you were to choose 1,000 people across the city in Chicago at random, about one would experience a shooting or a homicide victimization. But when you look at the group, the top bar, the group of individuals that Ready is targeting, you see that their likelihood of engaging in shooting and homicide, or being a victim, is 72 times higher. So that is extraordinarily high. And that's higher than the rate of shooting and homicide victimization that we see in the neighborhoods where Ready is operating. And the point of that is, we know where violence is most concentrated geographically, but now with these more precise ways of targeting, we can see that there are specific individuals within those highest risk neighborhoods that have extraordinarily higher risk than if we were to paint sort of a broader brush. So if we can be more precise with our targeting using data in combination with community intelligence, we can find these men who have the most complex needs and need to be reached by these services. So I think you all know, you've heard sort of the core of what Ready is. That I'm not going to talk about that. That's not my expertise. But relentless engagement and the core tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy and employment opportunities. And then again, extra support services. Ready is referring out to other sorts of supports that can't necessarily be met by those providers. And it's 24 months because after the 18 months of the program, Ready offers a lot of follow-up services for those men to help them sort of fully roll off into full-time employment with who they're working with. This is just a map to show you where Ready is operating. Again, predominantly on the south and west sides. where we see highest rates of violence. About 1,000 men have been through the program with 2,300 study participants. That's counting the control group who we're also measuring. And this is the list of the community providers that are involved. And the last point I just want to make about READY is, when we think about evaluations of programs that are reaching higher need population, we worry about a low take-up rate. We worry that a low share of the individuals who are offered the program are not actually going to show up. And so we projected, based on prior literature and what we sort of expected to see, a 27% take-up rate. But what we saw is actually 55% of individuals who are offered the program are taking it up, which is big, way larger than we expected. And you might also be concerned that attrition would be pretty high. But what we see is that of the individuals who are, sorry, the font is white, that's not ideal. After about a year, those who have been in the program from the point of orientation for a year later, 53% of those individuals are retained, so they're continuing to show up a year later. And then among those who are showing up, they're coming 76% of the time, so their attendance rate is also pretty high, higher than you would expect for this sort of intervention. So I think that just speaks to sort of the relentless engagement on the part of Heartland Alliance and the providers, and the services that they're offering once they're engaged are keeping them there. So we're going to continue studying this program. We have about a year left until we reach the full sample size, and we'll be able to report out on more sort of final impact outcomes of the program. We're also looking at getting some additional data sources. So not every incidence of violence is going to be reported to the police department. So we're working with hospitals in the area to get data on hospitalization records so that we can maybe fill in some of those gaps, some of those incidents that aren't reported to the police, but we see in hospitalization records. We're also looking to get some labor market data as well to say something about employment outcomes. And what we also hope to do, which will be really exciting, is to do some subgroup analyses. So we'll look at not just the READY population as a whole, but is the impact different among, depending on what referral pathway you came through? Or does the program have differential impact on certain types of crime and arrest types? Does it matter, do your characteristics as a participant matter as to whether or not the program has an impact? Things like that. And the last thing we're doing that I think is really important, and something I want to emphasize that we also care about, we primarily do quantitative evaluations. That's where our sort of expertise is. But to understand the impact of a program like READY, that's not enough. Data is not enough. So we have engaged a team of qualitative researchers to work individually with staff and participants to really understand the nuances of this program. What is the nature of the violence that they're experiencing? What do they think about the program? What could be changed? And so we hope that these sorts of findings will, one, improve service delivery for the program itself, but also really contextualize the study that we're putting together and put more of a human face to it. So, last sort of project I'm going to talk about, I've been focusing more so far on our work in the social service sector. So thinking about programs that are trying to reduce involvement by minimizing reliance on the criminal justice system, but to really think about a full, holistic, comprehensive strategy towards violence prevention. We also have to work with law enforcement and improve their efforts at reducing crime as well. So we do a lot of work with the police department, the state's attorney's office, the sheriff's office, et cetera. So I'm going to talk about some work we do with the police department. So in Chicago today, shockingly, about 100 violent crimes happen every day. And if you think about the size of the city, 2.7 million people, how geographically large it is, if you're a police officer and you're trying to engage in preventive policing, so you want to be at the right place at the right time to prevent a crime, that's a really hard task. That's a big thing to do. And it's a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. It's a little cheesy, but. So if you're a commander of one of CPD's 22 police districts, how do you know where to deploy your resources to be most impactful, to maximize public safety while also minimizing some of the social costs that might be associated with policing? And so while the Chicago Police Department has one of the more sophisticated data and IT infrastructures among other US cities, it, along with a lot of other US cities, has not been utilizing the data that's available to them in the most effective way. And so, for years, commanders didn't really have a consistent or formalized approach to looking at the data that was available to them and pulling out insights and patterns around arrests and retaliation and motive and things like that, often relying instead on human intuition, which is an important element. But if you're, as a commander once told us when we started this intervention, random patrol equals random results. If you're just randomly patrolling, you're not going to have the targeted effective results that you need to maximize public safety and minimize social costs associated with violence. And sometimes a helpful analogy is this is very different than how, for example, the private sector is going to deploy its resources. They're going to incorporate a lot of customer feedback. They're going to think about data and use those insights to refine their thinking time over and over again to be as effective and efficient as possible. Of course, policing is very, very different from how the private sector operates. But in 2016, when we experienced this horrifically tragic spike in gun violence, it became increasingly clear that the police department, they wanted to be more optimized in how they deployed their resources. So towards the end of that year, the city of Chicago, the police department, and the U.S. Department of Justice's technical assistance arm brought together a team of national experts in law enforcement, led by someone named Sean Malinowski, who at the time was the chief of staff to the LA police chief and is now working very closely with the interim superintendent in Chicago, to develop a suite of recommendations that could optimize the police department's thinking. And at the core of these recommendations was something called the Strategic Decision Support Center, so the SDSCs. So the SDSCs are physical rooms that sit in every district, or almost every district now across the city, to bring together the use of a variety of different data-informed management practices and new technology to help officers think more strategically about how to deploy resources in the right place at the right time. And so as part of this initiative, for the first time in history, CPD planned to bring on civilian analysts to do this work, to build out the capacity of the police department to understand and use data. And to assist with that new effort, because the city wanted to get around a very long hiring and procurement process, the Crime Lab offered the first cohort of embedded analysts that we raised money for and funded for a limited period of time. And this, I just wanted to give you a taste of the kind of analysis that you might see in an SDSC room. So this is an example of something that a commander of a district on the south side asked an analyst to work on. So at the time, we were seeing an uptick in vehicular hijackings and finding that those were related to a number of drive-by shootings. So this became an important priority to understand what's the pattern here, what's going on, where are these cars being stolen, where are they being recovered, and is there a link? And so the analyst was able, using data that the police department already had, identify the location, and these are the red dots, where cars were being stolen. And this is all in one police district, and the black borders are different beats within that police district. And find that they were being recovered in the neighboring district in one beat across just a couple blocks. They were all being recovered there. So with that intelligence, with that information, the commander and his officers, they were able to tie this to one suspect, and eventually found that that suspect was linked to, I think, a quadruple homicide. So this insight, using data that the police department already had, allowed the police department to discover these patterns and produce something actionable. And it was only because they had this extra capacity through these SDSC rooms to do that, to look at data in a different way, identify patterns, and have action as a result of that. And this is just one example. So, we heard a lot of anecdotal evidence about the effectiveness of the SDSCs, but, crime goes up and down all the time. It's very hard to identify a cause one way or the other. So we wanted to do our best to systematically quantify the impact of the SDSC rooms on violence in the neighborhood. So we studied the effect of the SDSCs alone in the Englewood district on the south side. And what we were able to identify is that the rooms, the different strategies employed in these SDSC rooms led to a 26% drop in shootings in the district. And that's pretty big. That translates to, at the time, about 100 fewer shootings over a 12-month period in Englewood. And that was the lowest number of shootings that Englewood had experienced since it had been systematically collecting data on shootings, I think since the early 2000s. what's also really important about this is we didn't find a meaningful increase in arrests at the same time. So, you know, it wasn't as if CPD was sort of flooding the zone with officers, and just by the nature of the fact that we were making more arrests, we were having an effect on shootings. They were not doing that. And so through some additional qualitative work, what we think we found here, what sort of suggested, is that officers are being more strategic. They're changing their behavior because of the data that they're receiving, and being able to put their resources, their officers, their cars, et cetera, more strategically in the right place at the right time to maximize public safety. We also found an increase in positive community interactions. And so this data is actually self-reported by officers, and we're doing some work to better understand what sort of activities are identified as positive community interactions. But we think this is enough to show that it's suggesting not only are the SDSCs causing an increase in public safety, it's also helping improve community police relations. And so since the launch of the SDSCs in 2017, which is when we studied Englewood, the police department has expanded the rooms across the city, and now they're in 20 of the city's 22 police districts. And police department is always having visitors from cities across the country and places around the world to learn about this sort of practice and how to use data better to inform policing. And the last point I'll make is, in addition to the capacity and availability of data improving law enforcement activities, CPD has started sharing the data that they pick out from the SDSC room activities with a lot of community organizations as well in Chicago. Street outreach organizations, faith-based groups, and also other city agencies that have their own resources that they need to deploy across the city. So it's improving knowledge sharing and communication between CPD and the community, as well as these other organizations who are also wanting to collaborate in reducing crime. So that's it. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Will we be able to get a copy of that presentation? I found it quite informative.
Yep, we can do that.
Thank you.
For sure.
Hi, my name is Phyllis Duncan. I'm the founder of Mothers of Murdered Sons. And just like Jan said, the information you have shared is quite impressive. My question is, do this information only address the Chicagoland area? We don't get that information here in Proviso Township about what's going on with the University of Chicago Crime Lab. Also, I have a question that my grandson asked me a few weeks ago, and that is, are Black folks the only people that's committing crimes? Because that's all he hears about growing up as a young Black male.
Yeah.
Why is it that the African American community is always researched in information about it? Do you just emphasize the Black community?
Yeah. So I'll answer your last question first. Our research is we're not targeting specific communities at all in the work that we do. This is just these are insights that are coming out of the data that we get on these different interventions. And it is I think a horrible and sad reality that violence is so disproportionately borne by certain groups of the population, specifically young Black men. And that unfortunately perpetuates a narrative that I think we see in the media. We do our best to focus our research on the entire city, whatever group you're from, but we're working with our community partners who are working in preventing and intervening violence with specific groups. So we sort of take our cues from our community and civic partners about as far as the populations that they're working with. But we're not by any means sort of honing in on specific subsets of the population. We're sort of pulling out from the data the insights that we're seeing. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. And then the first question, so we primarily work with the city of Chicago. We also all the time have conversations with other municipalities and cities and countries for that matter too, who want to understand our model and try to implement that in a way that's most appropriate for their community. So we're all the time always happy to have conversations with folks from Maywood or wherever to help you guys think through a model that might be useful. And we do, so in addition to a lot of these sort of bigger research impact evaluations, we do a ton of technical assistance. So, you know, we work with city agencies around Chicago, as well as a bunch of community organizations that just want to better understand the nature of crime and violence through the data. So we'll always put together sort of short, quick turnaround analyses, and I think we could talk to you guys about doing something like that for sure. Yeah.
Hi, Zach. You
Hi.
mentioned technical assistance. Did you send this information at Shy Hack Night?
Did we share it with them?
Yes.
I don't think this specifically, but we have employees who attend that all the time and work on projects and bring some of our work there to sort of work on together. But yeah, that's a great source of sort of knowledge sharing and things like that. Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Oh, right there. Oh, she raised her. Oh.
So you have the capability of analyzing other kinds of situations, like if there was a spate of kidnappings, they could utilize the crime labs to sort of identify information about other kinds of crimes.
Yeah, for sure. So if to the extent that the police department, if we're talking about Chicago, is collecting data systematically on things like kidnapping, and we get that data, we could look at that. It always, you know, I say that with a caveat that if we're looking for any sort of like causal impact of an intervention on something like kidnapping, it depends a little bit on the frequency of those events so that we have enough data to be able to say something. So I don't know. I imagine kidnapping is probably more rare in Chicago than shootings. No? Okay, I'm wrong. Yeah. So that's something we can, yeah. Okay. But no, very interesting. And we're happy to sort of hone in on questions like that if that matters to our city partners. Yeah.
Okay, hello, question here.
Yeah.
And this is probably not to you, but probably to Reddy. You mentioned that the age group is 18 and above, primarily, where the majority of the crimes are committed.
Victims, yeah.
And I'm wondering, if Reddy is attempting to engage that community, what challenges are you finding in engaging that 18 plus community, and what particular problems do you have or programming that you have that will reach them?
I'm going to punt that to you guys. I don't want to pretend to know that. I think you guys are going to know that better.
I'm not sure I know how to answer that. We the participants that come from the crime lab, for us to engage, we just engage them. It doesn't matter what age. So if the age range is 18 to 24, we engage them. We engage them, we re-engage them, and we relentlessly engage them.
So you're not really targeting.
No.
So Anthony's being modest. He's one of the best outreach workers. Typically, when we do get the referrals from any resource, urban labs, community resources, also youth, we had a presentation earlier, and we leave no stone unturned. It's basically 18 and up. We have some participants are in their 40s, maybe at the oldest might be 50, whatever. But it's like it describes relentless engagement. And we have a year to engage from the time that someone is randomized. So, and then it could be another 24 months after that. Yeah. So it's quite a long period of time.
Yeah.
And this is for all the communities, not just Ready Inglewood. It's also INVC who's here, and they might want to add to it.
I do want to add to that. One of the things that's really great about the model of outreach that the Institute for Nonviolence and Ready Chicago and our partners are using is that we intentionally hire folks from the community who have often know these drivers of violence or have been involved in the violence historically. So they know many of these people that we're looking to engage, right? Or if they don't know them, they'll know a family member or a friend. So those connections, those networks of folks are really important. So hiring intentionally from the community to engage with those in the community we're looking to help is one of the main ways we're able to engage with folks.
Thank you. I want to, in the interest of time, pause us here for a moment, not to say the conversation is ending, but maybe continue the conversation in another avenue. I want to thank everyone who's here today, the partnerships that are already existing and the opportunities to expand or rethink those partnerships in new and creative ways. This day would not be possible without the planning of Lucia Garcia in the Center for Community and Global Health. So I'd like to give her a round of applause. And I skipped right over Zach. We didn't give you a final round of applause. I was so eager to connect it.
Thank you.
It sounds like we have a lot more work for you, Zach.
Yeah,
So a few pieces of information. Make sure you've signed in for us, please. We can continue to follow up with materials, circulate PowerPoints, upcoming events, etc. If you need validation for your parking, we have those. Please see us at the table. We have a Stop the Bleed training following immediately, which you already know may have signed up for. If you didn't sign up, we still have additional capacity for you to stay. Lunch is available in the reception area, the vestibule out here. There are some tables to stand and chat with one another. The two questions I would put to you are, what did you learn today? What's staying with you? And what are you gonna do next with that information? What did you learn and what are you gonna do? So you can share those answers over lunch. Our final announcement is from Village Trustee Nathaniel Booker, who's gonna trot down here pretty quickly and give you a little announcement about an initiative with Census.
Hello, everyone. So just want to give you guys information in regards to the census. Today, all of the data and all of the information that was given in regards to programming that receives federal aid, state aid, all come from sources that come from federal government funding. So does everyone know that the census count is April 1st? Who knows that? All right. Does everyone know that it accounts for $675 billion worth of funding for social services, education, healthcare, housing, everything like that, infrastructure? That's federally. So in Illinois, it accounts for about almost $40 billion in budget. So for every 1% of a community that's not counted in the state of Illinois, over $1 billion is lost. So we got to make sure that we get our count up. When you look at Cook County as a whole, we had a 71% count in 2010, which meant 29% of our residents were not counted, which is a really drastic loss. Each person represents nearly $16,000 in funding. The federal government looks at over 300 different programs for different services that provide funding to us for our census. So Proviso specifically is what my focus is. I am the trustee for the Village of Maywood, but I also work with the Proviso Township. So if you just look at the western suburbs as a whole that represent Proviso, Oak Park River Forest, Leiden, Berwyn, and Cicero, that represents over $2 billion that was lost over the past 10 years in regards to our count not being done. And when we think of Maywood specifically, our participation rate was only 69%, which meant for Maywood, there were over 10,000 people not counted and over $165 million lost in regards to possible resources that could have been brought to the community. So not to overload you guys with a bunch of different numbers, but we want to make sure that we're providing awareness and education about the census in any and everything that we do. There is a table outside that has a lot of different census information that you can grab, that some is in Spanish, some is in English, and then you can also go to the website www.provisocensus2020.com. My contact information is at the bottom on the footer of the website to gain more information. And if you have a program or anything that you would like to have possibly funded within the Proviso Township to help get education and awareness out, again, anything in regards to healthcare, social services, education, housing, or infrastructure, we can help fund that thing. All right, thank you so much.